Hello everyone, let's get started. Today we're going to be talking about epidemiology. Epidemiology is a branch of science that studies the cause, distribution, and control of disease within populations. In our country, most of the epidemiology that is done by the U.S. Public Health Service, which is one of the branches of our government. And within the Public Health Service, there is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC. And the CDC is responsible for doing a lot of the work of epidemiology in this country each day. In order to discuss epidemiology, we have to become familiar with some of its terminology, including terms that are used to describe the prevalence of pathogens and the occurrence of infectious disease outbreaks. The term sporadic, for example, refers to the outbreak of a disease that is occurring locally, occasionally, and unpredictably. For example, there might be a sporadic outbreak of food poisoning that could happen, let's say, at a convention in a dining hall. It would be limited to that location, that particular convention. It only happens occasionally, and there would be no way to predict that that was going to happen. That could be described as a sporadic outbreak of food poisoning. When we're talking about infectious pathogens, though, one of the words that you'll hear is this word endemic. This word describes a pathogen and the disease it causes as being continually present at predictable levels within a population. In other words, there are some pathogens and some infectious diseases that we expect to see, and we can predict how many cases we should see across certain time periods. Think, for example, about the common cold or something like influenza. Those two diseases are caused by pathogens that are endemic in the United States. They are here. They're always here. And we can predict when we see more cases of the common cold or of the flu. We know, for example, that there is what we call a cold season and a flu season around the winter months. Those outbreaks of the common cold or the flu are predictable. We know when we expect to see them. We know what numbers we expect to see. There are many other endemic pathogens in the United States: chickenpox, the Lyme disease pathogen, the pathogen that causes the Zika disease, the Zika virus. There are many pathogens that are endemic in our country. There are other pathogens that we don't see in this country. It doesn't mean that they can't arrive here, but there are some pathogens that we just don't have in the United States. They are not endemic to the United States. When you hear the word epidemic being used to describe an outbreak of infectious disease, that word is telling you that it's occurring at a level that is greater than what we would predict for a particular population at a particular time. Now, epidemics can occur from endemic pathogens. In other words, we can have an epidemic of influenza, even though that influenza is here all the time. You can have epidemics from pathogens that don't normally live in the United States, that aren't endemic. The final word on the list is pandemic. We are in the midst of a pandemic right now. And a pandemic is simply a global epidemic. It's an outbreak of a pathogen and an infectious disease that is occurring at a level greater than what we would predict, and it is occurring on a global scale. We had a pandemic of influenza back in 2008 and 2009. That was the H1N1 pandemic. And we are in the midst of a SARS-CoV-2 pandemic right now. So epidemics are very important in terms of public health because they are outbreaks that are something we want to avoid. We want to be able to understand epidemics so that we can prevent them from occurring again. So some of the other terminology we use to describe epidemics are to describe how they are being propagated or how they're being spread. And there are two terms that we should be familiar with. One is the common source type of epidemic, and the other is the propagated source type of epidemic. A common source epidemic, like the name suggests, is an epidemic of a pathogen and the infectious disease it causes that arises from contact with a single contaminated source. For example, there have been instances where water has been contaminated, the water that serves an entire population, an entire community. There have been epidemics where food sources have been contaminated, and as a result, an epidemic has occurred. There have even been, historically, cases where the common source of the epidemic was a person that was carrying the pathogen without getting the disease. Typhoid Mary is one of the historical examples of this. Typhoid Mary was a woman who lived in England who happened to be a carrier of the disease typhoid. She was a carrier of the pathogen, which meant that she didn't get typhoid herself, but she was able to spread the pathogen that causes typhoid to people she came in contact with. And typhoid is passed from carriers and infected people not washing their hands after using the bathroom, and then touching food with their contaminated hands. And Mary, as the story goes, would work for a family as a chef or a cook and would pass the typhoid pathogen to the family. She would then go on and find another job in another house and cook for them and pass along typhoid to them, and so on until a public health official realized that Mary was the common denominator for all of these outbreaks. So common source epidemics arise from a single contaminated source, whether that is an inanimate source like food or water, or a living source like Typhoid Mary. Propagated source epidemics are different. Propagated source epidemics occur from contact with people. The pathogen is spread from person to person to person to person to person. So, for example, influenza epidemics are propagated source epidemics. The COVID-19 pandemic is a propagated source type. Anytime you have a pathogen that is spread by contact from person to person, you've got a propagated source epidemic. Two other terms that you've probably heard a lot recently that it's important that we understand are these terms quarantine and isolation. Quarantine is a term that describes the separation and restriction of movement of people who have been exposed to a contagious disease. And the reason that we quarantine people is to watch them and see whether or not they become sick with that infectious disease. In comparison, isolation is the process where we separate people who are sick with the contagious infectious disease in order to keep them away from people who are not sick. So those two words are sometimes used interchangeably, especially recently, and they mean very different things. We quarantine people who are healthy, but who have been exposed to someone who has a contagious disease, or who have been exposed to one of those common sources for an epidemic. They're not sick, but we're concerned that they might become sick. So we want to watch them across time, usually 2 or 3 weeks, to see whether or not they become sick. A person who's placed into quarantine will be released from quarantine if they don't become sick. In comparison, a person who is put in isolation is a person who is already sick. And the reason we isolate them is so they won't get anyone else sick. We were all asked to quarantine ourselves back in March when the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic was starting to ramp up. We were all asked to sort of retreat to our own homes and not go to work and not go to school, and only go out when we absolutely needed to, so that if we came down with COVID-19, we could then isolate ourselves, or if needed, get medical help. Since that time, our country has sort of opened up in bits and pieces, and we are now experiencing very severe epidemics of COVID-19 in parts of our country, in certain states. And looking back now, we should not have opened up, number one, so early, and number two, so completely, because we did not have the virus controlled enough at that point to prevent it from spreading. What we've started to see as states have opened up and people have been asked to wear face coverings in order to slow the spread of this virus is that people are questioning whether or not the government has the ability legally to ask them to wear a mask. It's become unnecessarily politicized as well. So let's take a minute and talk about the legality of quarantine and the legality of isolation, because a lot of people in our country don't know that there are laws on the books about the government's ability to both quarantine and isolate its citizens. There is a section, there's a clause in the US Constitution called the Commerce Clause. And that clause outlines the ability of the federal government and local and state authorities to use what's called police power to both quarantine citizens and isolate them if they become ill. These police powers that are granted by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution are basically designed to give the states rights to take action against people for the benefit of greater society. Again, a lot of people in our country don't know that this clause exists and that state and local governments have this authority. Let's take a look at some of the details of the Commerce Clause that deals with quarantine and isolation. This can be applied to humans, yes, but also other animals, domestic and wild. It can be applied to plant life and to actual just inanimate materials that are capable of spreading contagious disease. In other words, people, animals, plants can be quarantined, and other materials, things that are not alive, can be confiscated and destroyed if they're shown to be capable of spreading contagious diseases. These police power actions are especially granted at our borders. In other words, people who are coming across our borders into our country, legally or otherwise, we have this clause in the Constitution that allows authorities to do a medical exam on these people, whether they want that exam done or not. And if they are found to have any signs or symptoms of infectious disease, actions can be taken, again, even against their will. If people are thought to have been exposed, they can be quarantined. If people are showing signs or symptoms, they can be isolated. And there are actual locations all across our country in the various states where these quarantines and these isolations can take place. The other thing you should know is that this clause in the Constitution allows, again, state and federal government to destroy plants and animals that are capable of spreading infectious disease. The word we use is culling when we apply it to animals. So, for example, if a person had a herd of cattle that were found to have been exposed to a terrible cattle disease, or if a particular farm had one or two animals who were showing signs of this infectious disease, the government has the right to not only quarantine those animals, but to cull those animals, to kill them, destroy them, so that they are not a source of further spread of that infectious disease. Now, the people who lose animals or also crops through that clause, if their property is taken from them and destroyed, they can be compensated by the government. They are compensated by the government for that financial loss. On this slide, you're looking at a map of the United States, and I put this up here because I want to show you where what are called quarantine stations exist in our country. Now, the folks who carry out the duties of quarantine and isolation are the Centers for Disease Control, and they maintain 20 different quarantine stations across the country that you probably never heard of, but have sort of come back into the limelight now that we're in the midst of a pandemic. If you look, there are several quarantine stations in the northeast part of the country, including in Boston and in New York. There are quarantine stations in Detroit, in Chicago, in Minneapolis. There are not any quarantine stations in the middle part of the country, but that's most likely because of the rural populations in that area. There's a quarantine station in Seattle, up in Alaska, down the west coast, and across the southwest. So there are 20 different places, physical locations in our country, where the Centers for Disease Control has the legal authority to both quarantine and isolate U.S. citizens.